Hi, second graders. It's Mrs. Sylvester, and we have a reading lesson today going back into our text, comparing and contrasting The Earth Dragon Awakes and Seek the Sun. And the lesson you had on Tuesday that Mrs. Cicchini shared with you, you were comparing and contrasting some short stories and a poem and thinking about Seek the Sun. But today we will go back to our two main texts. And as we compare and contrast, we're specifically going to think about the key details that the authors use to present culture in the text. And as you probably know and remember, a culture can give an example of how people live, what they typically do, their traditions, also known as customs. It can relate to the food that they eat, their clothing, special beliefs that they have, and ways that they live their life. And we'll see how when an author presents details about the character's culture, how it can help us as a reader. So we will think about analyzing those details and then making the comparison and contrast between those two cultures in the text. So we'll just reread parts of The Earth Dragon Awakes. I know we had it a while ago, but hopefully you remember some of the details as I reread the pages and Seek the Sun. So the first part I'm going to reread is from The Earth Dragon Awakes, and this is in the beginning of our story on page 12. And as I read, in addition to thinking about the culture, let's really focus on how our character Chin is comparing the Chinese village where he used to live in China to the village or city of San Francisco where he now lived with his father. And let's think about the details that are presented that the writer includes. So here I'm going to reread the text that's on our screen here. Chin and his father say goodbye to the cable car crew and get off in Chinatown. It is so much bigger than his village in China. There are around 10,000 Chinese who live there, but not all of them speak the same dialect as he does. A dialect is kind of like a language, but within a language, it might have some similarities and differences. So in the Chinese language, there can be different dialects that are similar to the main language, but some different words and can be completely different in some ways. Though they come from China, he cannot always understand them. So it is home and yet not home to Chin. Even the buildings are different. They are all so much taller than the ones in his village. Some are 3 or even 4 stories high. A few look like the Chinese ones Chin saw in Hong Kong before he got on the ship to come here. Most are American buildings. They look so plain compared to the ones at home. There are no tilted roofs or carved windows, but the Chinese have added signs and decorations to them. The American buildings look like they are wearing Chinese disguises. So as I stop and look back as a reader, I'm noticing that the author is giving me details about how Chin remembers his village in China and how he's comparing the city of San Francisco to the small part of that city called Chinatown, which would be similar to his village in China. And I didn't say before, but a group of people's culture and a country's culture can also relate to the types of homes they live in and how a city is built and what it looks like. So here, I feel that as the author includes those details, it's really helping me as a reader connect with the character Chin and know that since his home is so different from the big city of San Francisco, he maybe feels very lonely or maybe a little sad. And it even says that in Chinatown, it's not, even though it might have some ways that is like his village in China, for example, the different dialect is something different than what he spoke in China. So that can be very different too. Language can connect with someone's culture as well. The author also gave me details about what the buildings look like. The American buildings, he said that they're very different, and that the Chinese have added signs and decorations to them. So again, I'm noticing that as Chin is comparing how the Chinatown in San Francisco look and how it's different from his village in China, I'm thinking that he maybe is, as it says, feeling at home but not at home. So maybe an uneasy feeling, which we know as we continued reading with the earthquake coming, Chin maybe would feel even more afraid. Let's now jump ahead to page 15, just a few pages after that, and think about now the details that the author includes about how the neighbors are feeling. So remember I said culture can relate to what a person believes in and how they feel. As they mount the steep steps, Chin hears the clacking of mahjong tiles. And that's a game that is popular in China, almost like a board game. In that game, players match pieces. Someone is playing the scales on a fiddle. Other people are arguing. Another person is crying. Still another is laughing. It is a small village in itself. So I think that the author here included these details to give me, as a reader, a good picture of what Chin's home life is like. So it seems very busy with a lot of people and doing different things, including some aspects of the Chinese culture, like the game, the mahjong tiles, and then maybe enjoying playing music. Music connects with a person's culture as well. So all those details, as a reader, it makes me feel like I'm there. I can imagine it better, and I can understand the character's point of view. So now let's jump to Seek the Sun and think about, does this author also include details about the character's culture? Let me reread pages 6 through 7. Spring in the year 1966, a builder came to measure the empty lot across the street. He was followed by 3 machines and a truckload of men. The men and machines dug a square hole in the ground and drove pilings deep down into the earth. They built walls high up into the sky, 154 feet high. The new building towered above all the other buildings on the block. Now the sandal maker's small 2-story house stood in the shade of a 9-story building. When the sandal maker and his wife rolled up the bed quilts in the morning, even on a sunny morning, it was still dark and cold in their house. Next door, on the left, the tatami maker's house stood in the shade of the same tall building. The tofu maker's house on the right stood in the shade too. The building cast such a long shadow, it kept the sun from shining on all the houses in one corner of Asakusa. The sandal maker tended to his plants as lovingly as he always had, but his holly tree grew weak in the shade. His tiny bonsai trees stopped bearing fruit. The breezes that once gently blew in Asakusa now whipped around the tall building. The breezes turned into gusts of wind that lifted the sandal maker's wife's skirts when she went outside. The wind tore up her umbrella when it rained. The wind grew so fierce it spun the dust and dirt into swirling tornadoes, and it even uprooted the sandal maker's precious plants. "You would think a dragon had moved into the neighborhood," he cried. "How can we wrestle with a dragon? How can we seek the sun each day here in the shadow of a tall building?" "We'll find a way," said his wife. "Our fortune said so. We will find a way to seek the sun, and our neighbors will help us. We will go to the courthouse to talk to the judge." So on this page, I heard a lot of details about how the tall building that was built blocked the sun. So I can maybe think that, like most people, the sun is very important and maybe a good symbol of life, especially connecting to growing plants, as the sandal maker was concerned about his bonsai tree still growing. So I can maybe make the inference that the sun is very important in the Japanese culture. And I see too that they are comparing the wind to a dragon. And that's making a connection to how in The Earth Dragon Awakes, the Chinese people compared the earthquake to a dragon. So maybe thinking about how these two cultures have a similarity of comparing things in nature to animals such as dragons. So that's what I was just answering, and we don't know for sure if in the Japanese culture, wind is always compared to a dragon, but just having that key detail maybe can lead us to believe that that might be a part of their culture, at least thinking about causes of nature. And maybe the dragon is popular for powerful forces like an earthquake and wind. So let's think back to the settings of the stories and think about any other similarities and differences just based on these two parts of the text that we reread. I'm going to think about how they are alike and how they are different. That's the same thing as saying comparing two things are the same or alike, and then how they are different is how we can contrast. And a lot of times we use a Venn diagram, but this is like a T-chart, and I can just list the ways that they're alike on one side and list the ways that they're different. So even though we had two different texts, they both were in communities. We know we read about Chinatown within the larger city of San Francisco in The Earth Dragon Awakes, and then we read about the small village in Seek the Sun. We know that they interacted with the neighbors, and people had to work and go to temples. So that connected with a part of their culture and their religious beliefs. They were different, of course, though, thinking about the exact location of the settings and the type of homes that they lived in. So today, as we reread, we were really thinking about comparing and contrasting, but with a lens of looking at the culture and going back to our question, why do writers include cultures in their text, and how can we as a good reader analyze those details? We know that as we think about culture, we can understand the character, understand the problem maybe a little bit better, understand the setting, and then it's really neat too to compare and contrast with our text-to-text connection. Great reading, Cardinals, and we will see you next time.